So, good evening and welcome, dear friends, to this third lecture on modernism and politics. So, we'll continue from where we stopped last time, discussing what was happening in Germany, and let us see the entire discourse, how it proceeds on political interface with modernism. A very important point that I wish to make about modernism is its links with capitalism. As we all know, modernism was always having a lot of interaction and interface with capitalist modes of production, and art was now no longer a very exclusive, individualistic area where artists could claim that they were producing autonomous art. So I feel even Butler, for example, the author of this book, like the new critics who belong to the Anglo-American school, he takes the help of Crane to suggest that art ideally should have nothing to do with politics. But this is a contentious statement because, like many other professions, many other fields in which people work, I don't think that artists can also, can claim that they have nothing to do with politics and that they are apolitical. Like people working in other fields, I think they also have a commitment to the political and the social. However, we should not forget this very important point I made, that modernism has deeper affinities with capitalism, and hence it was not very easy for modernists to defend their art practices in the name of individual autonomy, because the individual interest somewhere had something to do with the market practices, with social practices, economic practices, which assured individuals their interest, but at the same time, it gave them a sense of having possession of what they produce. So I think this we have to understand. So it was not actually easy for modernists to defend their practices in the name of individual autonomy. So modernists were experimenting with new practices in the context of the advanced capitalism of the times. So in that context, I think we have to look at the modernists and their practices of art. And this interface with capitalism, what did it produce? It actually helped produce the Bauhaus kind of architecture, which is a very good example of modernist design, which tried to use new material to show how the material that is used in design could itself become the highlight of that particular design. So it was a kind of technology that was working, supporting production in art. It is like photography, for example, which can help you produce new art. So the left actually, the idea is about progress and the idea of progress. And as we know, Butler himself has some problems with this notion of progress, which the Marxists, of course, believe that moves uh, in a linear way towards emancipation of all. So the left actually saw itself as progressive, more progressive than the others also, while the right was accused generally of being very nostalgic, of having a kind of sentimental uh, approach to art, and as if they wanted very badly to preserve something which was fast losing its value. So the right was accused of being nostalgic. Modernism couldn't perhaps evade the political compulsions they were under. Modernists could not evade the political compulsions they were under. So I think it was difficult for them to take positions, and that is why we find this confusion even in Butler. So it was not easy to avoid taking positions in a in an atmosphere in the 20th century that was charged uh, with ideological differences and divisions. So it was a highly ideologically charged historical context, and the modernists had a very difficult choice to make. Artists like Strauss, Mahler, Stravinsky, and others, and Schoenberg, they are mentioned by Butler to suggest that each of them practiced his own style of art despite the pressures of politics on them. So it was modernists went on with their individual practices, though they showed here and there some resistance to any kind of prescription for their practice. So some others used eclectic innovative methods. As we know, eclecticism is opposed to dialecticism. Eclecticism is one directional because it is more polemical. It has a kind of a one-sided message it wants to give. So some of them were eclectic, using eclectic methods, and they were of course innovative, and a few others tried to blend art and technology, as it happened with the Bauhaus experiment. So Bauhaus art was basically technology driven, kind of trying to have a blend of both art and technology. Butler is clearly confused, as I was telling you, with the notion of progress, because he doesn't understand who can be labeled as progressive and who uh, can be labeled as conservative. So he makes a whole list of authors and asks us to identify the progressive among them. And then he makes his own decision and says, when you make that comparison, you find that these writers are progressive, and the others, though they claim to be progressive, may not be seen as progressive. So it is difficult to agree with Butler, who argues that moral and political ranking of artists and writers, though valuable they may be, it doesn't help us to understand modernist art movements. Uh, I think there's a problem here when he talks about moral and political ranking of artists, because I think Butler is still struggling to understand the relation between morality, art, and politics. It's a very strenuous and very complex relationship which we need to analyze if we have to understand how politics, morality, and art work together. They have their interplay, and how artists try to place themselves in some position with regard to this. So when we look at art, modernist art, whether it is Dadaism, Cubism, we finally come to understand that the modernists were trying to have a new and different understanding of the human, because the human uh, himself, or the human itself, or the what we call the essence of the human, was fast changing. And so the instability that we see, in the 20th century, where the stabilities of the human was actually getting lost, and the idea of the human was becoming more unstable. So I think the modernists were trying to catch hold of these fast changing times and try to represent it in some way. So even in music, there was no single genealogy. So each artist was probably confused how to represent the uh, objects of their time, and how to produce those art objects and what to represent. I think they were confused. So they followed their own rules. So it was not like they had a common genealogy. So musicians also, like Schoenberg and or Stravinsky, they conform to their own ways of thinking and modes of doing their art. So there was no single genealogy for modernist art. Butler argues that in the midst of all these political pulls and pressures, modernists managed to address various interest groups, whether they were political, social, or religious groups. And he gives the example of Dorothy Richardson and Virginia Woolf, who were trying to address feminists, Yeats and Joyce, who were trying to address Irish nationalists, Auden, Elliot Stravinsky, who stood in defense of Christianity. So he gives examples of these writers and artists who practiced their own ideologies and addressed these sections of people who also believed in the same ideologies. So most of modernist art therefore was generally either leftist or liberal, and they were coexisting with each other. And all modernist works are political. This is what Butler says. If they have interactions with current political conflicts, he says that. But I would like to add a caveat here to say that whether they have such interactions with political conflicts or not, I think modernist works are, whether they like it or not, somehow linked to the politics and history of the time. Uh, so, however, he adds that art also has a moral ethical function. I think this was mostly the view of the conservative artists who were more worried about morality and ethics, which they thought art should always try to present to people. He refers to Gross's paintings and his portfolios of drawings to emphasize this point. Please refer to page 97 for this picture and what Gross has to present. So Butler uses Gross to suggest that even people like Gross were trying to give some message, a moral, ethical message to people. Uh, and he says that Gross's work symbolized the dehumanization that arises within capitalist societies when powerful people, powerful men treat others as mere objects. So there is some element of exploitation of people by capitalists that Gross recognizes, and he thinks it appropriate to present this exploitative nature in capitalist society, the dehumanization, especially of the exploited class. So modernists either continued with experimentation in cubism, futurism and the like. As we know, the experimentation continues, but what happens to the political import of their art? This is what Butler asks. But I think uh, not all artists were focusing more on giving a political message. So I think consciously or unconsciously, somewhere something of their political ideas would always be reflected in their art. So the answer to Butler's question could be that some of them who felt that they could not function without their autonomy and they felt that they had to always take a rebellious posture, such artists rebelled against all authority. Some of them could have even faced exile, or as I presume, some like some others who must have made some compromise with realism. So I think this gives you a clear picture of all the politics and the political compulsions under which the modernists were trying to operate. So keep reading and take a good look at what you have done, and then try to get back if you have any questions, maybe later when I arrange for a video class where I can meet all of you. Thank you.